Alright guys, not gonna lie, I'm really resenting filming this because I had filmed this. I had already gone through the entire video of filming this wrap up for June, and then I uploaded it onto my PC so that I could edit it now, and I just checked it and there's no audio on it. So love that for me, meaning I have to refilm this entirely. I will say I went over it relatively quickly last time. I think I had like under 40 minutes, so hopefully that'll be the same for the second time around, because wrap-ups are always a little bit of a nightmare because you kind of have to formulate your complex feelings about the books and try to get it down as quickly as possible without necessarily skipping over things neither, because I do still want to give you guys a good idea about everything that has taken place with my reading experience for those books. But so yeah, without further ado, let's dive into the books that I read in the month of June. As always, I have already done a mid-month check-in, and so I will briefly go over those books within this video, but if you want my full thoughts on these books, or if you want any sort of information about my experience with those, do check out that first video for that. There will be 3 numbers on the screen at all time, which will be the full number on my physical TBR. At the beginning of the month this was 65. The amount of credits that I have in my book buying credit system at the beginning of the month this was 25, I think. The number there will be correct. There will be correct. There? Now I'm confused where the number is. But in any case, wherever there's room. And then the third number is the amount of books that I've read throughout the month. That number will be climbing throughout the video, and it counts up all books that I read, so not just the physical ones. There's 2 other numbers only applied to my physical books, but that third number applies to everything that I've read throughout the month. So as I said, there are a number of books that I'll be mentioning here that are from the first half of the month. I'll just be mentioning them here as a sort of way to make you aware of which books I read in the first half, so you can go check out that video, but also to get those numbers up to date, because I don't do that in my mid-month check-in. So first up, I finished a novella within Arcanum Unbounded. So I read Mistborn Secret History. This is a part of Arcanum Unbounded, but I still haven't read the full collection, so this does not subtract from my physical TBR. This does not add credits to my book buying credit system. In that first half of the month, I also finished This Is How You Lose a Time War, which I read as an audiobook, so it also did not affect my physical TBR. Another book that I finished in that first half of the month is History of Wolves by Emily Friedlund. So this is physical book, so it counts for 1 credit, and it is 1 book off of my physical TBR. Next up, I also finished In the Miso Soup by Ryo Murakami. This I finished as an ebook. I do not own it physically, and as a result it also doesn't impact those numbers. And then the final book that I finished within the first half of the month of June was Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. This is a library copy, so as a result it also does not impact those numbers. So first half of the month in that sense was not a great reading month, because my ultimate goal this year, my primary goal, is to get that TBR down to 0. Not by the end of this year, somewhere next year. I am kind of hoping, starting to lean towards trying to finish it towards the end of March 2022. We will have to see how far I get this year. That is my primary goal, and so in that first half of the month I've just reduced it by 1 only. So hopefully the second half of the month can help us a little bit out when it comes to that. I did add a book to my physical TBR in the second half of the month, and that is the Jasmine trope by Tasha Suri, but I also finished it at the same time. So I finished this towards the end of June. I will say that it is a difficult one for me to talk about, because objectively I can see that this was a good read, and it's also not like I hated it, like I disliked it, like I had to drag myself through this reading experience. On the other hand, I also emotionally didn't really connect with this story a whole lot. There was just something missing which made me not connect to it, and that's kind of a bummer, because that's the main reason for reading, of course. And so while there wasn't anything while reading that was like keeping me away from it, or that I could actively point to as being like, I don't like this about that book, there was also just not that connection, nothing that was really drawing me into the story. And I kind of feel like the further I got into the book, the more I had that feeling. Like in the beginning, I was very much connected to the character of Priya, but the further we got along into the book, the more I started to not really care all that much about what happened to this character. And so that's my main problem, is that I don't really care about the characters. And as a character-focused reader, I need a connection to characters. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that I need to like the characters, but for some reason towards these characters, I somehow felt quite indifferent, which is not to say that they're not interesting characters, because they definitely are, but I don't really know whether it was just something about me at that time in which I'm reading it that made me not emotionally connect or anything like that, but it was just a bizarre experience for me. But so, in The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri, we are following two characters particularly. We are following Priya and we are following Malini, okay? And so these are two characters inhabiting somewhat of a different world, because Malini is a princess of the realm. She is part of the central force of the empire. However, her brother is kind of trying to get her out of the way. Her brother wants her to sacrifice herself, to have herself be burned alive, in order for her to kind of transcend her mortal shell and become the sort of symbol for the people to rally behind. She, however, wants to live. She, however, does not want to give up her life for her brother, especially since she does not like her brother and does not believe her brother should be on the throne. She is shipped off to a sort of rebellious region within this empire, and that is where she will come into contact with Priya. Priya, our second main character, is a young girl with a mysterious past that we will be diving into more throughout the book. She grew up in this rebellious region in a temple that was burned down when she was a small child. And the reason for that will become clear throughout the book, and that is kind of that mysterious past that we're diving into. I don't know what the problem with this one is. I like the setting, I like the world, I like those elements that we explored. I like the complexity of the female characters. Aside from these two female characters who will be entering into a female-female relationship, we also have a third female character, and I think I actually like the relationship between Priya and that third character more. It's kind of a complex family bond, in the sense that they look out for one another and they support one another, but they also begrudge one another for certain things. They also have these sort of like negative feelings towards one another, but ultimately they can definitely rely upon one another because of that close bond that they share because of past events. And I kind of think I like the exploration of that more than I like the exploration of the female-female relationship. And I really cannot fully pinpoint what the problem is, why I couldn't really relate. I think part of the problem is the fact that it was such a stationary story, because due to circumstances of, that princess being imprisoned, we're not really moving around in the world a lot. And I wanted to see more of the world, but we weren't really getting a whole lot of that. And a lot of the elements that I liked in the beginning, when Priya was more independent, so to speak, were her relationships with other people in the world, were the things that she was doing outside of that setting. And so because the majority of the books took place in that limited setting, which I wanted to explore more and we weren't exploring to the extent that I wanted to, I think that is part of the reason why I at some point disconnected. But I still say that I could also recognize the good things that it was doing. It was just that they weren't the type of things that were exciting me or that were pushing me forward. I could definitely see like, that's a very interesting thing to delve into, or that's a great quote, but emotionally I wasn't getting to that place. So I'm definitely continuing on with this one. I had high hopes for this one, and I don't know whether it's like my anticipation that kind of ruined this experience or not. And so I'm just hoping that if we see more of this world, if we get to be a little bit more active in the plot, that I will latch onto it more. But at the same time, I'm not a reader who needs those types of things generally. So I'm just hoping that it was a case of me reading it at the wrong time, and that if I pick this up later when the second book is going to come out and I'm rereading this one, that at that point I will have that connection, that something will click, and that it will be the experience that I hoped I was going to have with it. Next up, I'll briefly mention The Bastard of Istanbul by Elif Shafak. This is a book that I finished towards the end of June. I have done a sort of like TBR tackle video for this, meaning it's a new series that I'm starting in which I'm tackling my TBR 3 books at a time. In this case, I was tackling 3 books that I've received received in the Books That Matter subscription box. I talk about it in length in that video, and so I do want to kind of promote that video this way, so I won't talk about it too much here, but I'll definitely give you a little bit of an indication here already. But so the majority of the Bachelor of Istanbul is centered around this family living in Istanbul. It is a family only inhabited by female members, by women, because most of the men in the household die at a young age. There's just one man in the family left at the moment, and he kind of escaped Istanbul. He went off to America to study, and he's kind of escaping his fate by staying there at the moment. So we're following these Turkish women in Istanbul, but at the same time we're also having a look at an Armenian family in the US and their link to this original family in Turkey that we will also be following. It has a great cast of characters. I definitely love that whole family dynamic of the Turkish family, but also the Armenians that will later get entangled within this one, as one of the members of the Armenian family will end up rooming with the Turks for a time. And a lot of the story is about the Armenian conflict, the Armenian genocide, and so it is about two sides of that story kind of meeting up and addressing their prejudices, addressing the images that they have in their head of the way in which Turks are nowadays, or the way in which, or what has taken place in the past. You know, on the Turkish side, they are kind of in denial over what has happened at that point in time. They see what happened to the Armenians at that time as a consequence of the Ottoman Empire. They don't really associate it with Turkey, whereas the Armenians kind of see the Turks still as those sort of like evil people who did wrong to them all of those decades ago. And so throughout this book, we will see those two sides meet each other and kind of address the images that they have made in their mind. Aside from that, I really love the way that this book is structured, because each chapter is named after an item of food. And while food isn't sort of like essential to the storyline, to the plot of this book, it definitely really set a mood in each chapter that item of food will then make an appearance, and thus, because it is the name of the chapter, it will also gain prominence throughout that chapter as well. For me personally, that meant that I was super hungry throughout reading this, and that I was just really craving food all the time. I definitely also went to get some Turkish food myself, because I just really was craving it. I really was in that atmosphere. Food is definitely such a big part of culture, and so that focus on the different foods of Turkish culture also really helped you transport into that culture. And so yeah, I absolutely enjoyed this one. Highly recommend it. 5-star. Absolutely loved it. Another book that I'll briefly mention here, just so that we can get those numbers up and running, up and updated. Just so that we can get those numbers updated, is a secret TBR book. So I finished a secret TBR book. Yeah, I don't know when I'll be able to finish this one. My month of July so far is going very erratic. So I don't know whether I'll be able to finish the 2 other books for this TBR tackle in July, or whether it will be another one of those that takes months for me to finally find the time for it. But I am making progress towards another TBR tackle video, and this is a book for it. Next up, I also finished another physical copy, which is the final physical book for this month, and that is Eleanor, Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman, which I absolutely loved. This is another 5-star read. It's a book that made me cry. It is divided in 3 parts: good days, better days, and the bad days definitely were the ones in which I had to cry a whole lot. So in Eleanor, Oliphant is Completely Fine, we are following our main character, Eleanor, who is living a perfectly adequate life. She has a place of her own, a job of her own, she is making enough money to get by, and she doesn't necessarily see the need for much more. However, she doesn't really have a lot of human connections. She has a phone conversation with her mother every week. She has a social worker checking up on her every once in a while. But when it comes to connections with her work colleagues, for example, things aren't running as smoothly. However, on her side, she doesn't necessarily see that as a problem. When a new work colleague of hers kind of reaches out to her a little bit more, she's kind of pushed into his company quite often, and as a result she's starting to see the benefits of human connection. She's starting to see that there is more out there, and that perhaps she also wants more out of life. Perhaps she also wants there to be more. Throughout this book there are some hints that perhaps Eleanor isn't as socially adept as other people might be, which sometimes led me to think whether maybe this was autism representation or not. At the same time, there was also a lot of references to the fact that there is some past trauma that she has to deal with, and that kind of complicates that idea of whether this is autism representation or not. I think I've seen a few people mention that they really identified with Eleanor being autistic themselves. I'm just a bit hesitant to refer to it in that light or with those words because it is never referred to within the book itself. And so I would say if you're interested in the autism representation within this one, definitely try and find some own voices reviews and see what they are saying about this book. But as I said, it is not mentioned as being autism rep within this book. It's not trying to say anything about autism and about autistic people within this book, and it's definitely also not trying to push the agenda that Eleanor needs to change herself in order to be able to have a better life or anything like that. That is definitely not the messaging of this book neither. So if you're wary about the combination of a potentially autistic character and that whole idea of her, you know, wanting to find more in life than what she currently has, the way in which she's going to find more in life isn't through changing herself or changing the way that she acts. There will be slight changes throughout this book, but those changes are more linked to her dealing with that past trauma, finding a way to grow through that trauma, finding a way to process that trauma. And that is definitely what we'll be focusing on in that section, Bad Days. I kind of feel like I went to therapy myself through reading this book, even though Eleanor's past trauma definitely has nothing to do with my life. In no way did that touch upon anything that is personal to me, but I still felt so heavily emotionally invested, emotionally involved with her storyline. I felt all of her emotions. I felt so much for what she was going through when she was trying to avoid going into certain trauma. I also wanted to avoid that. I also wanted to be like, no, don't make her go through that trauma. She's not ready. Can't you see she's not ready? So I kind of feel like I went to therapy with Eleanor in order to be able to process the things that she had processed and the things that I as a reader had to process with the experience of this book. So yeah, absolutely loved it. All the praise for it is very much valid. It was not what I expected going into it. I kind of expected it to be more or less a sort of story of a woman who isn't happy with her circumstances in life and who's trying to change it. But it is definitely more a story of a woman who is perfectly content with the way that she is living her life, however, through circumstances, is coming to want more than what she had been previously content with, and is coming to terms with some of the past trauma that she is carrying with her. Final book for this wrap up, and I'm almost through having filmed it a second time. I Hear the Sunspots by Yuki Fumino. So this is a manga. This is a manga that features disability representation and LGBTQIA plus representation. In this one we are following two boys, Kohei and Taiki, I think. And so these are kind of opposites. It's kind of an opposites attract type of story. Kohei is very much aloof. He's somebody who's seen as being very arrogant because he doesn't really interact a whole lot with the people around him. And it kind of seems like he's just brushing them off, doesn't want to connect to them at all. Whereas I'm gonna continue calling him that, but I'm really not entirely sure that that's his name, so I'm so sorry. Taiki is kind of a sort of like very, you know, charismatic person, somebody who easily makes friends. He is somebody who is kind of like in love with food. He's constantly eating. He's also a character who cannot seem to hold a job because he's way too fired up and he easily comes into conflict with the people around him. And so these two characters through circumstances meet, and then Taiki finds out this is really not his name. I'm so sure of it now that that's probably not his name. But so he becomes the sort of like note taker for Kohei, because Kohei turns out to have a hearing problem, and so he cannot fully hear all the things that the teacher is saying, or he does not it takes him longer to process it, and so he doesn't have the same capabilities of, you know, writing it all down while trying to make out what the teacher is saying. And so Taiki will be helping him with that, and through that's interaction, a beautiful friendship, later on a beautiful relationship grows. It's a very interesting manga, however it's also like a first manga in a series, and I feel like plot-wise, not a whole lot happens, and so there's not a whole lot keeping the story together except for the growth of that relationship. And while I keep saying that I don't necessarily need a plot, for some reason in this one I at the end kind of felt like, so what was this story actually about? Whereas I oftentimes read books that are about nothing without having a problem with it, and it's not like it was a real problem here neither, but it kind of made me feel like I needed there to be a sort of start, middle, end to the story, and that structure was missing. But I would say that, you know, I often have that experience with first books in comic book series, for example, so perhaps that will be the same when it comes to these manga series. So I did definitely think that there was great disability representation in it. It's disability representation for hearing problems, but also, for example, for having a disability that is progressing over time. I have a progressive disability, and I definitely latched onto that side of Kohei's story. Kohei is losing more and more of his hearing, and so he also has to deal with those emotions of knowing that the hearing that he still has today might be gone in a few years. He might not have those same capabilities in a few years' time. It is also addressing the frustrating reality of having people treat you differently once they find out. So his friends kind of started to shy away from him after he was diagnosed because they felt like he wasn't reacting the same way as he always had, and because of his hearing problems he was having more difficulties catching on to their conversation, and rather than them changing their conversation or their voice or, you know, the speed of their speech in order for him to be able to latch on more, they kind of just left him behind and kind of were just like, you know, he cannot keep up with our conversation, he's not, you know, making jokes anymore the way he used to, and so, you know, they just kind of left him behind because he wasn't the same friend as they had been living with all that time before that. And so as a result, Kohei has become very withdrawn, and this book will definitely feature into that. We'll definitely see him kind of opening up a little bit more to this new friend, but also it will definitely be looking at the way in which he's still kind of trying to protect himself from future harm, and it will see Taiki address that and address the way that that hurts him, because, you know, at some point in the story Kohei tries to steer away from him because he doesn't want to lose this new friend, and then Taiki kind of has to say, but you're hurting me by doing that, you know, you are also my friend, and your withdrawing from me is hurting me the way that you fear that me withdrawing from you will hurt you. I don't know whether that was still grammatically correct or whether that still made any sense. But so yeah, I very much enjoyed that little manga, and I will definitely be continuing on with that as well. But it's also not a huge priority for me neither, because, you know, I mainly felt like it was really charming and I really enjoyed that experience, but it was also not something that blew me away or anything like that. So I will be continuing on with it, but it's not a priority. But so yeah, that is it for the month of June. So I reduced my TBR to, I have to remember these numbers because I actually don't. But so I think I reduced my TBR to 61 or 60? 61 I think. I think I reduced it by 4 books. Which, you know, is the kind of reduction that I need to do on a monthly basis in order for me to get to my goal for the end of the year. However, I am, like, at this point in time, I can definitely tell you that the month of July is gonna stir some things up when it comes to those numbers. But so yeah, overall the month of June was pretty good. I had definitely 3 5-star reads, I think, 3 books that are solid contenders for my favorite book of the year at this point in time. So a great reading month in that sense. I definitely shot myself in the foot a little bit by pledging 10 books for whatever you wanted on, because I was kind of struggling with that because of the reading slump at the beginning of the month. And so I'm definitely hoping to treat July a little bit differently. At this point in time in July, I'm basically just reading whatever except for my TBR. So we'll just have to see how that ends up developing, but I'm enjoying that type of freedom that I'm allowing myself a lot more than the sort of stress that I was putting on myself in terms of what I wanted to achieve in the month of June. But so I was able to reduce my physical TBR by 4 further books in the month of June, so that is definitely great. That is basically the average that I need to hit every month in order for me to get under 40 books by the end of the year. So hopefully I'll just continue on along that same track hopefully from time to time even doing better than those 4 books, so that I can continue to get lower and lower into my physical TBR. But so yeah, if you guys have read any of these books, definitely let me know down below and we can talk about them, about your experience, and kind of compare, contrast, talk about certain aspects and things like that. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and see you guys for a future one. Bye!